the shadows, bearing the marks of unspeakable violence, mutilated by two monsters. The victim's face was disfigured, a grim testament to the brutality endured. Bloody evidence told a story of sexual abuse, and every fragment of the case was soaked in horror. Scattered items of clothing hinted at a terrible tragedy. As the investigation unfolded, it revealed not just a crime, but a gruesome story of a bloody murder. Those who investigated the case were stunned, their emotional reactions mirroring the inhumanity of the crime. The tragedy of that night lingered long after, haunting all who encountered it. This was not just a murder. It was a nightmare that unveiled the depths of human cruelty. Amber Gibson was born into a struggling family in South Lanarkshire, Scotland, to Peter and Annery Gibson. The family included her older brother, Connor. From the outset, their life was marked by hardship and deprivation. Living in a disadvantaged neighborhood, they faced poverty and limited opportunities. Peter, the father, seemed to thrive in this marginal environment, while the rest of the family suffered. He refused to hold a steady job, instead indulging in drinking while the family scraped by on government assistance. The financial aid was barely sufficient to meet even their most basic needs, leaving the family constantly teetering on the edge of desperation. The atmosphere in the Gibson household was anything but peaceful. Peter was not only negligent, but also abusive. He ruled the family with cruelty, creating an environment filled with fear and tension. While Amber was spared the worst, Connor bore the brunt of both physical and emotional abuse. Their mother, Annery, also suffered terribly. Peter regularly beat her, often in front of their children, showing no remorse or hesitation. The violence was relentless, and Annery felt powerless to protect herself or her children. Despite the constant abuse, she hesitated to take action, fearing the consequences of confronting Peter. Eventually, Annery reached her breaking point and turned to the police. During the investigation, Peter's true nature became apparent. He showed no remorse and continued to issue threats against his wife, which only strengthened the case against him. His violent history came to light, revealing a disturbing pattern of cruelty that extended beyond his family. Among his most heinous acts was an unprovoked attack on a young boy, whom he brutally beat, causing severe injuries. When asked to explain his actions, Peter could provide no justification other than his inability to control his anger. Peter's crimes did not stop there. Evidence emerged of a horrifying incident in which he raped a woman. He attacked her, tied her up, and began to strangle her. The victim later said that she had resigned herself to death. But for reasons unknown to her, Peter suddenly stopped the attack. These incidents, along with others spanning from 2001 to 2008, painted a chilling picture of a man devoid of empathy or self-control. In 2008, Peter was sentenced to 10 years in prison for his numerous crimes, which ranged from domestic violence to sexual assault. With Peter incarcerated, it seemed the Gibson family might finally find some peace. Connor, then 5 years old, and Amber, just 4, were no longer subjected to their father's terror. However, their newfound freedom was short-lived. Annery, unable to cope with the years of abuse and the pressures of single parenthood, turned to alcohol. Her descent into addiction left her incapable of caring for her children. Neglect soon replaced the physical abuse they had endured, prompting child protection services to intervene. Connor and Amber were removed from their mother's custody and placed with foster parents, Craig and Carol Nean. The Neans, a kind and loving couple, had longed for children of their own, but had been unable to conceive. They saw fostering as an opportunity to provide a stable and nurturing home for children in need. When Connor and Amber came into their lives, Craig and Carol embraced them wholeheartedly, determined to offer them the love and care they had been denied. However, not everyone supported the Neans' decision to foster the brother and sister. Amber and Connor's biological grandparents contested the arrangement, accusing the Neans of seeking financial gain through government subsidies for foster parents. Despite these accusations, the court ruled in favor of Craig and Carol, granting them custody. The brother and sister moved to Hamilton, Scotland, where they began their new lives. The transition to life with the Nean family marked the beginning of a long journey toward healing for Connor and Amber. Years of exposure to violence and neglect had left deep emotional scars, particularly for Connor, who had endured the brunt of their father's abuse. He struggled with trust issues, often withdrawing from adults and peers alike. Amber, though less directly affected by physical violence, carried her own burden of anxiety and insecurity. Craig and Carol worked tirelessly to create a safe, stable environment for the children. Recognizing the importance of addressing their trauma, the Neans sought professional help. Both children began attending therapy, where they were encouraged to express their feelings and confront the pain of their past. The Neans also made a conscious effort to instill a sense of normalcy in the children's lives. Amber, on the other hand, developed a love for painting, using art as a medium to process her emotions and express herself. These moments, though seemingly ordinary, were transformative for the children, serving as reminders that they were valued and loved. Despite the progress made, the journey was not without setbacks. Connor occasionally relapsed into bouts of anger and mistrust, while Amber struggled with feelings of guilt over leaving her biological mother. The Neans, however, remained patient and understanding, guiding the children through their challenges with compassion. By the time Amber and Connor reached adolescence, they had begun to dream of brighter futures. Amber spoke of becoming an artist, her sketches and paintings reflecting the resilience she had developed. Amber was by everyone as a sweet, kind girl whose gentle spirit seemed remarkably untainted by the harshness of her early years. Her cheerful demeanor and vibrant energy brought light to those around her, and she possessed an unyielding resilience that allowed her to overcome the trauma of her childhood. Despite the cruelty she had endured, Amber had an innate love for life. She was intelligent and mature beyond her years, qualities that made her new foster family proud. Amber's interests in art and singing flourished in her new environment, and these creative outlets became a source of joy and healing for her. Unfortunately, her brother Connor's story unfolded quite differently. The violence he endured in his formative years left deep and lasting scars. Connor exhibited behavioral problems that set him apart from his peers. He was withdrawn and struggled to form friendships, often lashing out in anger. His sudden outbursts of aggression, particularly toward girls, became a hallmark of his troubled personality. Despite his attractive appearance, Connor's cruel nature and dark humor alienated those around him. He frequently made morbid jokes about death, which unsettled his classmates and led them to avoid him. Few recognized the severity of his issues, dismissing his behavior as eccentricity rather than a cry for help. Beneath the surface, Connor battled profound mental health challenges. He used social media as an outlet, sharing cryptic posts that hinted at his inner turmoil. In one particularly revealing post during his school years, he detailed his struggles with bulimia, depression, anxiety, and attention deficit disorder. These admissions offered a glimpse into his fractured psyche, but they failed to prompt the intervention he desperately needed. Speculated about his mental health, but no formal evaluations or diagnoses were ever pursued, leaving Connor to navigate his difficulties alone. Connor's struggles extended into his academic life. He showed little interest in learning, frequently skipped classes, and performed poorly in school. His inability to connect with others deepened his isolation, and he often blamed his father for his problems. In Connor's view, his father's tyranny had created the chaos in his mind and life, leaving him unable to break free from the shadow of his past. Despite his longing for acceptance, Connor's efforts to socialize were consistently thwarted by his erratic behavior and unsettling demeanor. His relationship with Amber was especially fraught. Though they shared a common history of trauma, the brother and sister were unable to form a bond. Foster parents Craig and Carol Nian recognized the tension between them and made a concerted effort to minimize their interactions. From an early age, Connor's aggression toward Amber was apparent, and the Nians feared leaving them alone together. Their encounters were closely supervised, yet even under adult oversight, Connor found ways to pick on Amber, exploiting any perceived slight to vent his frustration. As the children grew older, the divide between them deepened. To protect Amber, the Nians placed the brother and sister in separate schools. Amber attended a regular school, where her kind nature and talents helped her thrive. Meanwhile, Connor was transferred to specialized institutions designed for teenagers with emotional, social, and behavioral difficulties. While Amber found solace and a semblance of normalcy, Connor continued to struggle. His inability to form romantic relationships exacerbated his anger. Rejection by his peers, especially girls, fueled his resentment, which he often directed at his sister. The lack of proper intervention during Connor's formative years played a significant role. Teachers, peers, and even his foster parents failed to recognize the full extent of his issues. Specialized education offered some support, but without a comprehensive approach that addressed his mental health, Connor's problems only grew more entrenched. Society's tendency to dismiss troubled youths as lost causes left Connor isolated, reinforcing his belief that he was beyond treatment. The Nians, though well-meaning, faced the daunting task of raising two deeply traumatized children with vastly different needs. Their efforts to protect Amber while attempting to help Connor reflect the challenges of fostering. The hostility between Connor and Amber reached a breaking point during their teenage years. Amber became increasingly vocal about her fear of her brother, pleading not to live under the same roof as him. Connor's aggression became systematic, and his relentless targeting of Amber created an unbearable environment. The Nians, recognizing the severity of the situation, took steps to separate the brother and sister further, ensuring that Amber had a safe space away from Connor's wrath. The girl was adamant, and as a result, she was placed in an orphanage. Meanwhile, Connor remained with his foster parents until he turned 18. In 2020, upon reaching adulthood, Connor chose to move out. He was weary of living under their guardianship and sought independence, leading him to join a Hamilton project known as Blue Triangle. The initiative aimed to provide temporary housing for individuals lacking stable accommodation. Essentially, this marked the beginning of Connor's life in what was effectively a homeless shelter. Despite living separately, Amber and Connor maintained occasional contact. However, their communication was fraught with tension. The sibling dynamic, marked by frequent arguments in the past, improved slightly with physical distance. The reduced proximity gave them fewer opportunities to clash, but it did little to shield Amber from further tragedies in her life. In June 2021, Amber endured a harrowing ordeal when she was attacked and raped by 20-year-old Jamie Stars. He had previously served time for another sexual assault and was inexplicably released on bail despite facing multiple charges. Tragically, while out on bail, he assaulted Amber. For this crime, he was sentenced to 10 years in prison. The attack left Amber deeply traumatized, and her recovery was slow and painful. Despite receiving emotional support from friends and relatives, the pain lingered. Connor, however, remained emotionally detached and showed little interest in his sister's suffering. Desperate for familial support, Amber sought to rebuild her relationship with Connor. On November 26, 2021, she confided in a friend about her plans to meet him. Amber was optimistic, believing that this meeting could be a turning point for their strained relationship. She hoped the sibling rivalry and past conflicts would fade, allowing them to reconnect. Amber still resided at the orphanage during this period, and Connor coordinated with its administration to facilitate the meeting. She was granted permission to leave for the evening, with the understanding that she would return later that night. Amber shared a selfie with Connor on social media, smiling and looking genuinely happy. This photo turned out to be the last anyone saw from her. Around midnight, Connor returned to his hostel. His disheveled appearance, dirty hands, and erratic behavior immediately raised concerns among the staff. When questioned, he claimed to have argued with his sister during their meeting and left abruptly. However, he now wanted to confirm her safe return to the orphanage. Connor made a phone call to the institution, only to learn that Amber had not come back. Alarmed, the orphanage staff reached out to foster parents, who also had no information about Amber's whereabouts. Connor stated that their meeting had started at the foster parents' home before they took a walk to Cadog Glen Park to discuss personal matters. He claimed they parted ways there, and he returned to the hostel. Amber, however, never came back. When the orphanage filed a missing persons report, the police discovered that Amber had left all her belongings behind, suggesting that she had no plans to run away. Her lack of a romantic partner further dispelled the theories of an escape, leaving investigators increasingly convinced that what was happening was strange and truly creepy. Connor's behavior became a focal point of suspicion. While his sister's disappearance alarmed everyone else, he exhibited an unsettling indifference. He failed to reach out to the foster parents or inquire about the search efforts. Connor's passivity stood in stark contrast to the urgency of the situation. He simply sat in the hostel, waiting, offering no assistance in the search for his missing sister. During this period, the police intensified their search efforts, as they needed to obtain any leads that might help unravel Amber's disappearance. Naturally, they turned to the last person known to have seen her alive: her brother, Connor. Investigators questioned Connor, who admitted that he and Amber had walked together that evening. According to his account, as usual, a heated argument erupted between them. Connor claimed that he left his sister in tears at the park after their quarrel. He explained that he had wandered aimlessly through the outskirts of town before eventually making his way back to his hostel. His explanation immediately raised suspicion. Connor's assertion that he got lost while walking sounded implausible. He had grown up in the area and was familiar with its layout. He added that he had fallen into a ditch in the dark, which, he claimed, explained why he appeared disheveled and dirty when he came back to the orphanage later that night. Investigators found his story inconsistent. When Connor was asked to pinpoint the location of the ditch, he faltered, claiming he couldn't remember. While he easily identified where he had met Amber and where he had left her in the park, his inability to recall other critical details seemed evasive. Further attempts to gather information from Connor were met with resistance. When asked if anyone could corroborate his account or if he had seen anyone else during his walk, Connor avoided the questions, appearing visibly nervous. His behavior left investigators unconvinced, but without concrete evidence, they had no choice but to release him for the time being. Meanwhile, the search for Amber continued, with growing urgency. 2 days after Amber's disappearance, on the morning of November 28th, the police received a chilling call from a 45-year-old man named Steven Corgan. He reported finding a body in Cadzo Glen Park while out for a walk. However, what he revealed next horrified even the most seasoned detectives. Steven confessed that he had not contacted emergency services immediately. Instead, he admitted to sexually assaulting the corpse before calling the authorities. He claimed he felt remorse afterward and decided to turn himself in. Investigators arrived at the scene, roughly 200 meters from the bridge where Amber was last seen. The condition of the body was gruesome. Amber's lifeless form was discovered beaten, naked, and clearly sexually assaulted. Forensic experts later confirmed that Steven's DNA was present on the body, including in intimate areas. Steven stated that upon discovering Amber, he had dragged her body away from the trail to avoid being seen, committed his vile act, and then covered her with branches. The site he described matched where detectives ultimately found Amber. Initially, Steven became the primary suspect not just for the post-mortem assault but also for Amber's murder. However, forensic evidence soon complicated the narrative. Upon examining Amber's body, the medical examiner discovered 8 distinct bruises around her neck, consistent with manual strangulation. A hematoma was discovered in Amber's brain, caused by prolonged strangulation. This, coupled with a disfigured face and a broken nose, provided horrifying evidence of the brutal beating she had endured. The level of violence suggested a deeply personal motive. The forensic expert concluded that Amber was first attacked and beaten. A blow to the head rendered her unconscious, but the ultimate cause of death was strangulation. Near Amber's body, investigators found her torn clothes and underwear, which appeared to have been ripped off in a frenzy, likely during the assault. The body was heavily smeared with dirt, bearing clear signs that it had been dragged across the ground. Strangely, forensic analysis revealed that Amber had died 2 days before Steven Corgan reported finding her body. At the time of Amber's death, Corgan had an ironclad alibi, conclusively ruling him out as her killer. This revelation reignited suspicions around Amber's brother, Connor. His peculiar behavior and history of cruelty toward his sister painted a damning picture. One particular detail stood out. Connor had made a social media post mourning Amber's death several hours before her body was officially discovered. How could he have known she was dead when she was still officially listed as missing? Interest in the case grew. Connor reached out to a local newspaper, offering to give an interview about his sister. He described Amber as a kind and loving person who had faced many hardships in her life. The journalist agreed to meet him on December 2 at a small cafe to share Amber's story with the community. However, Connor never showed up. By that time, he was already in police custody, arrested on suspicion of Amber's murder. Detectives began investigating Connor more thoroughly, determined to uncover evidence that could definitively tie him to the crime. Surveillance footage became pivotal in piecing together the final hours of Amber's life. Security cameras captured Amber and Connor walking together through the city and crossing a bridge near the park. At 9:51 p.m., Amber posted a selfie with Connor on her social media account. She looked happy in the photo, suggesting the brother and sister were getting along, at least outwardly. But the footage revealed that approximately 90 minutes later, Connor returned alone. He was seen on another set of cameras located near his dormitory, where his suspicious behavior deepened the mystery. Before entering the building, he discarded part of his clothing in a trash container. This small but incriminating act led police to search the dumpster, where they recovered the jacket Connor had worn that night. Unlike his other clothing, which he kept and attempted to clean, the jacket had been discarded. It bore traces of dirt and blood, both of which forensic analysis confirmed belonged to Amber. Investigators also examined his shoes, finding additional traces of Amber's blood and DNA on them. The police speculated that Connor had not disposed of all his clothing simply because he couldn't afford to replace them. Instead, he had cleaned them as best as he could, but not thoroughly enough to remove all evidence. This misstep worked in the detectives' favor, as they were able to recover incriminating DNA traces linking him directly to Amber. Further damning evidence came from Amber's torn underwear. Blood not belonging to Amber was found on the garment. DNA analysis revealed it belonged to Connor. Investigators hypothesized that he likely injured himself during the struggle, leaving behind his blood. Even more disturbing, bodily fluids found on Amber's body confirmed that Connor had sexually assaulted her. These findings removed any doubt about his involvement in the crime. Detectives turned their attention to Connor's mobile phone. His digital activity provided additional proof of his guilt and his attempts to cover up the crime. On the day after the murder, Connor sent a message to a group chat with 5 other people, asking for help in searching for Amber. However, less than a minute later, he sent a separate message to Amber herself, asking if she was okay. These contradictory actions hinted at an attempt to craft a false narrative. Shortly afterward, he sent another message to the group, dismissing his earlier plea for help as a bad joke. Connor's actions after the murder showcased a chilling lack of remorse. His attempts to feign concern for Amber's well-being and his social media post mourning her death were calculated moves to deflect suspicion. Yet his inability to fully erase evidence, coupled with his suspicious digital activity, ultimately sealed his fate. Later that day, Connor conducted several suspicious Google searches, including queries on avoiding phone tracking and protecting data from police investigations. These searches made it clear he was worried about being caught and was actively seeking ways to cover his tracks. During the inspection of Connor's mobile phone, a deeply troubling revelation came to light about the nature of his relationship with Amber. Conversations extracted from Amber's correspondence painted a grim picture of prior abuse. Connor had previously assaulted Amber and threatened her with severe retaliation if she disclosed his actions to their adoptive parents or the police. These threats appeared to be a key reason Amber was desperate to leave her foster home at the young age of 14. Whether it was fear of her brother's threats or a sense of loyalty and love for him, Amber chose to stay silent. However, evidence suggested that shortly before her death, Amber may have finally decided to confide in her foster parents, potentially triggering the events that led to her murder. The investigation reconstructed the events of the fateful night with chilling clarity. Surveillance footage showed Amber and Connor walking together, appearing calm and at ease, as if trying to mend their strained relationship. The footage suggested no immediate tension, but things changed when they entered the park. It is believed that a conflict erupted, possibly spontaneous, but just as likely premeditated by Connor. Investigators could not rule out the possibility that he had carefully orchestrated the entire meeting, deliberately guiding Amber to an isolated location to execute his plan. Regardless of whether it was premeditated or impulsive, the confrontation escalated, culminating in Connor's brutal attack. Amber was beaten severely, losing consciousness after a forceful blow to the head. However, the forensic report confirmed that the cause of death was manual strangulation. Connor choked his sister until she passed out and then sexually assaulted her. Afterward, he abandoned her body in the park, dragging it a short distance before leaving it partially hidden on a footpath. The evidence suggested no attempt to properly conceal the body, hinting at Connor's recklessness or possibly his belief that no one would trace the crime back to him. Connor's adoptive parents spoke publicly after his arrest, expressing their shock and disappointment. They revealed that Connor had always been troubled, struggling with social adaptation and forming relationships. His fascination with dark and violent themes concerned them, but they had no idea of the extent of his cruelty, especially toward Amber. They acknowledged that Connor had shown little affection toward his sister, and that their relationship had been marred by tension and hostility. The murder shocked the community, not only because of its brutality, but also due to the unsettling circumstances. Amber had endured violence not just from her brother, but also from another predator, Steven Corgan, who had committed unspeakable acts against her lifeless body. The fact that 2 such individuals had crossed paths with Amber in such a short span of time horrified the public. The community mourned her tragic fate, struggling to reconcile the idea that 2 monsters had been free to commit such atrocities. Connor's behavior following Amber's disappearance further fueled public outrage. Unlike the community and their foster parents, Connor showed no interest in the search for his sister. He avoided communication with his foster parents and made no effort to assist in finding Amber. His social media post mourning her death came across as hollow and calculated, especially given that he posted it hours before her body was officially discovered. This cold indifference painted a portrait of a young man devoid of empathy. The overwhelming evidence against Connor left his lawyer with a difficult case. The defense argued that there was no direct footage of Connor attacking Amber, suggesting that while he had walked with her that night, he was not responsible for her death. However, this argument fell apart under the weight of forensic evidence. Connor's DNA was found on Amber's underwear and body, and the blood on his clothing matched Amber's. These facts were irrefutable, leaving the defense's claims weak and unconvincing. Connor's behavior after the crime also undermined his defense. His internet searches for methods to avoid detection demonstrated premeditation and a guilty conscience. Furthermore, his dismissive attitude toward the search for Amber painted him as someone who was not just guilty, but also deeply unrepentant. Her silence about Connor's earlier assaults reflected the complex dynamics of fear, love, and shame that many abuse survivors face. By the time she decided to stand up for herself and confront her brother, it was tragically too late. But we shouldn't forget about the creepy person who discovered the girl's body and abused it. After the arrest of 45-year-old Steven Corgan, the case took another disturbing turn. Steven had confessed to sexually assaulting Amber Gibson's lifeless body after discovering her on a park path. During his trial, he struggled to articulate why he committed such a heinous act. According to his own testimony, Steven claimed he couldn't resist the impulse when he came across the murdered girl. This admission not only shocked the court, but also posed a challenge to the prosecution, which had to carefully consider the charges against him. His DNA, found in 39 separate areas on Amber's body, had significantly complicated the murder investigation, further delaying justice for the victim. Steven's defense leaned heavily on his father, 79-year-old William Corgan, who adamantly denied his son's involvement in any wrongdoing. William described Steven as a decent man and found the accusations of necrophilia impossible to believe. According to William, Steven had been at home shortly before the incident, behaving calmly and showing no signs of aggression. He also mentioned that Steven had recently fallen and injured his hand, which he argued would have made it physically difficult for him to commit the acts described. However, William could not account for the overwhelming evidence. Steven's DNA was found in intimate areas of the victim's body. Elder Corgan's testimony did little to sway the jury. Steven's ex-wife also took the stand, and her account starkly contrasted with his father's characterization. She described Steven as a violent and dangerous man who had physically abused her during their marriage. She testified that she had lived in constant fear of him, and while she was horrified by the crime, she admitted she was not surprised by his involvement. Her testimony painted a grim picture of a man prone to violence and impulsivity, lending weight to the prosecution's case. Steven's lawyer attempted to construct an alternative narrative, suggesting that Steven had moved Amber's body to shield passers-by from the traumatic sight of a murder victim. The defense argued that Steven's confession of necrophilia was a poorly conceived joke and not a reflection of reality. However, this claim fell apart under scrutiny. Forensic evidence showed Steven's DNA in places that could not be explained by merely moving the body. Male bodily fluids were found on Amber, providing undeniable proof of a sexual assault. The jury was left to reconcile Steven's apparent lack of empathy with his bizarre attempt to justify his actions. While Steven's actions horrified the community, the most shocking aspect of the case remained the betrayal Amber suffered at the hands of her brother, Connor Gibson. From an early age, the brother and sister endured an upbringing marred by neglect and abuse. Their father was violent, and their mother was indifferent, leaving both children emotionally scarred. Instead of bonding through shared trauma, Connor and Amber's relationship was riddled with hostility. Connor's aggression eventually led to their separation in foster care, further eroding their already strained bond. Friends had warned her about Connor, urging her to stay away, but Amber believed in second chances. On the fateful night, she agreed to meet him, determined to rebuild their relationship. Tragically, her trust was misplaced. Connor lured her to the park under the pretense of a heartfelt reunion, but it became the scene of her violent death. Throughout the trial, Connor remained emotionless, seemingly detached from the horror of his actions. This lack of remorse raised questions about his mental health. Psychologists testified that Connor likely suffered from severe psychological disorders, exacerbated by the abusive environment in which he was raised. Being older, Connor had clearer memories of their father's cruelty, which experts suggested might have shaped his violent tendencies. Connor's defense team argued that he had long sought help for his mental health struggles. His social media posts revealed a young man grappling with deep emotional pain, openly discussing his difficulties and desire for support. However, his cries for help went unheard. Connor's lawyer pointed to systemic failures, arguing that society's neglect had played a role in his descent into violence. The public was outraged and deeply saddened by the case, particularly by the grim reality that Amber was victimized twice, first by her brother and then by Steven Corgan. The horrific nature of these actions caused widespread discussion in the media and among people. Amber's biological grandparents weighed in on the tragedy, blaming the foster care system and the foster parents who took in Connor and Amber, as soon as the foster parents began receiving financial support for their foster children. According to them, the couple showed little genuine care for the children's well-being once the financial assistance began. They also expressed concern that the foster parents' indifference posed a danger not only to Amber and Connor, but to all of the children under their care. This wasn't an isolated case. Amber and Connor were reportedly not the only foster children in the household. The foster parents vehemently denied these allegations. They maintained that they had always acted in the best interests of the children who had come to them from troubled and often traumatic backgrounds. They argued that fostering such children was inherently challenging, especially when dealing with severe behavioral issues like Connor's aggression. They explained that Amber's move to an orphanage was a decision made not out of neglect, but for her safety. The foster parents insisted they had no knowledge of Connor's violent tendencies until much later, and that the separation was meant to protect Amber from further harm. By the time Connor turned 18, he chose to leave their home and move into a homeless shelter. The foster parents asserted that this decision was made entirely by Connor, and they had no way to prevent it. Despite their inability to keep Connor under their roof, they attempted to maintain some sense of family by encouraging the brother and sister to stay in contact. For a brief period, Amber and Connor did try to rebuild their fractured relationship, but the foster parents could never have foreseen the tragic outcome that awaited them. Despite these accusations, the foster parents defended their actions, explaining that they were ill-equipped to handle the complexities of Amber and Connor's relationship. However, there was more than enough evidence to prove Connor Gibson's guilt. The trial lasted 13 days, after which the jury went to deliberate on the verdict. The jurors unanimously found Connor Gibson guilty of murdering and assaulting his 17-year-old sister. He received a life sentence. Despite the brutality, he was given the right to apply for parole after 22 years of imprisonment.